Dragged from the river by an omega, a wounded wolf lived. Unaware a king's life was saved. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's return to Elena Moore. The river had swelled overnight, its surface dull and restless as gray clouds slid past the moon, and Elena stood at the bank with cold seeping through her boots, listening to the rush and pull as if it were breathing on its own. She was used to being alone here, an omega who kept to the edges where the pack paths thinned and the forest opened its quiet arms. But tonight the air felt different, heavier, as if the woods were holding their breath. She was turning to leave when she saw it, a dark shape caught between rocks near the bend, moving just enough to be alive. And the sound she heard wasn't a growl or a call but a low, unsteady breath carried by the water. Elena knelt, heart racing, and recognized the shape of a wolf, larger than any she had seen up close, fur soaked and weighed down, eyes half-lidded but aware, watching her without fear or threat. The current tugged at him, sliding over smooth stone, and instinct told her to step back, to remember what she was and what she wasn't, but another instinct, older and quieter, urged her forward. She tested the water with her hand, flinching at the cold, then waded in until it reached her knees, bracing herself against the push as she reached for the thick fur at his shoulder. The wolf didn't snap or struggle. He leaned into her touch as if he understood the bargain she was making, and with a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding, Elena pulled, inch by inch, using the rocks for leverage, muscles burning as the river resisted. When they reached the bank, she collapsed beside him, laughing once in disbelief before the chill caught up to her, and she wrapped her jacket around his torso, pressing it close to keep warmth in and the night out. The wolf's breathing steadied, slow and deep, and his gaze never left her face, not pleading, not demanding, simply present, as if he were memorizing the shape of her kindness. Elena checked him the only way she knew how, gentle hands, careful movements, whispering that it was going to be okay, even if she wasn't sure who she was reassuring. She glanced back at the river, at the dark water that had almost taken him, and then at the forest, where distant sounds hinted at lives moving unseen, and she made a choice that would ripple farther than the current ever could. She stayed, keeping watch as the clouds thinned and the moon found its way through, unaware that the life she had pulled from the river carried a crown she could not see, unaware that the quiet strength she had shown would soon be answered by a destiny that had been waiting for a hand like hers. The night stretched on with a patience Elena Moore had learned to respect, the kind that asked for stillness rather than answers, and she stayed beside the wolf as the river whispered behind them like it had secrets of its own. She built a small barrier of fallen branches to block the wind, careful not to disturb him, then rubbed her hands together until feeling returned, counting breaths to keep the chill from settling too deep. This place had always been hers, a narrow strip of ground between water and trees where no one looked for an omega who kept quiet, and as she listened she could hear the distant rhythm of the forest waking and resting in turns, insects ticking, leaves shifting, the faint echo of a call far off that made her shoulders tense. The wolf lifted his head slightly, ears tilting, and she followed his gaze into the darkness, wondering if he sensed what she could not, wondering if she should move him again or trust the shelter she had made. Elena checked his side, finding the warmth steady and reassuring, and she exhaled slowly, reminding herself that she was not a healer, only someone who stayed when it mattered, someone who knew how to wait. Memories crept in as the hours passed, uninvited but familiar, of packed paths she was not welcome on, of glances that slid past her as if she were part of the landscape, of learning to measure her days in small, certain tasks that asked nothing back. The wolf shifted, settling closer, his breath brushing her wrist, and she found herself speaking softly, telling him about the river after storms, about the way it calmed by morning, about how the light would come and make everything look possible again. He listened in the way animals sometimes did, not with words but with presence, eyes clear and intent, and when she paused he gave a quiet sound that felt like agreement. She noticed then how his fur caught the moonlight, darker than night but threaded with a subtle sheen, how his size did not feel threatening but contained, as if strength were resting rather than pushing forward, and the thought surprised her enough to bring a small smile. Elena reached into her pack for a strip of clean cloth, using it to secure the jacket so it would not slip, and she measured the time by the slow crawl of clouds across the sky, guessing the hours until dawn by instinct alone. At one point she thought she heard footsteps on stone and her heart jumped, but the sound passed, and she realized how exposed she was here, how easy it would be for others to misunderstand what they saw, yet she did not move away. She chose instead to sit straighter, to place her hand where the wolf could feel it, steady and unafraid, a promise she had not planned to make. The forest seemed to respond, growing quieter, the night holding its breath again, and Elena felt the weight of that attention without knowing why. She watched the horizon until it softened, until the black gave way to blue, and she whispered that morning was coming, that he had made it through the worst, unaware that far beyond the bend, beyond the trees and the paths she avoided, the absence of a king was already being felt, and that the quiet courage of an Omega by the river had set something ancient in motion. Morning arrived the way it always did here, quietly and without asking permission, the light thinning the shadows and turning the river into a ribbon of dull silver as Elena more flexed her fingers and realized how stiff she had become. She shifted carefully, easing her weight off her legs, and the wolf stirred, lifting his head with a soft sound that made her smile despite the ache in her back. He looked stronger now, eyes brighter, breath even, and when she checked his side again the warmth felt steady, reassuring in a way that made her chest loosen. Elena considered her options with the practical calm that had kept her safe for years, the distance to her cabin measured in memory, the risks weighed against the promise of shelter, the way the path curved through trees she knew by heart. Leaving him here felt wrong, not because he could not survive, but because the river would rise again and the forest would grow busy with daylight, and kindness unfinished had a way of asking for more. She rose slowly, testing her balance, then gathered her pack and the jacket, folding it with care, speaking softly, as if the wolf understood every word. She told him she needed to move him, that there was a dry place with a roof and water close by, that the walk would not be long if they took it slow, and he watched her with that steady attention, head tilted, as if listening for the truth beneath her voice. When she offered her arm, he accepted it, leaning enough to share his weight without overwhelming her, and together they found a rhythm that worked, step and pause, breath and step, the forest opening and closing around them. The distance felt longer than it was, measured not in miles but in effort, yet Elena did not complain, focusing instead on the details that grounded her, the smell of damp earth, the feel of bark under her palm when she steadied herself, the way birds resumed their calls as if granting permission. At her cabin, small and weathered but sturdy, she cleared space by the hearth, laying down clean cloths, setting water within reach, then guided him inside where the air was warmer and the light kinder. The wolf settled with a grateful sigh, stretching out and resting his head where he could still see her, and Elena set about the quiet work she knew, heating water, cleaning what needed cleaning without fuss, checking that he was comfortable, that nothing pulled or pinched. She moved with the confidence of someone who had learned to care without recognition, her touch respectful, her words simple, and when she finished she sat back on her heels, studying him as if seeing more than fur and bone, noticing the way the room seemed to accommodate his presence, as if it had been waiting. Outside, the day went on, footsteps passing on distant paths, voices carried and lost, but inside the cabin time slowed to match the rise and fall of breath. Elena poured herself a cup of water and took a measured sip, aware of a strange calm settling over her, the sense that she had done exactly what she was meant to do without knowing why. The wolf closed his eyes, resting, and for a moment the world felt balanced, a small sanctuary carved from choice and patience, unaware that far beyond the trees, questions were being asked, and that the life she had chosen to shelter was not merely healing, but remembering. The afternoon unfolded with a gentle insistence, sunlight shifting across the cabin floor as Elena more moved through familiar routines, aware of the wolf's presence the way one becomes aware of a steady heartbeat in a quiet room. She prepared simple food for herself, keeping the motions unhurried, glancing over now and then to check that he rested easily. And each time she looked, she felt the same calm certainty settle deeper, the sense that nothing needed to be rushed. Outside, the forest resumed its ordinary sounds, wind in the branches, distant water over stone, and somewhere farther off the faint movement of others passing along paths that never quite reached her door. Elena stiffened at the hint of voices once, then relaxed when they faded, reminding herself that she had lived on the edge long enough to recognize the difference between passing and seeking. She returned to the hearth and adjusted the cloths, careful to keep the room warm without crowding him, and as she did, the wolf opened his eyes, following her with a quiet focus that made her slow even more. There was intelligence there, she realized, not in a way that demanded explanation, but in a way that invited respect, and she spoke as she worked, telling him about the weather, about how the river would drop by evening, about the way the woods changed when night came again. He listened, ears shifting, and when she paused, he rose to a sitting position, steady and composed, his size filling the small space without making it feel smaller. Elena watched him stretch, noting how controlled the movement was, how little effort it seemed to take, and she felt a flicker of curiosity she quickly set aside, reminding herself that recovery often brought surprises. She offered him water, holding the bowl while he drank, and their proximity brought a warmth that was not heat but presence, a sense of shared stillness that felt almost ceremonial. Time slipped by unnoticed until the light outside softened and shadows lengthened, and Elena realized she had been smiling without knowing why. She cleaned up and set the cabin in order, leaving space where space was needed, and when she finally sat on the bench near the door, the wolf shifted closer, not crowding, simply choosing to be near. The quiet deepened as evening approached, and with it came a subtle change in the air, a pressure that made the forest seem attentive, as if something were listening beyond the walls. Elena noticed it without fear, trusting the same instinct that had led her into the river, and she placed her hand on the floor between them, palm down, a simple grounding gesture she had learned long ago. The wolf lowered his head until it was level with her hand, not touching, just close enough that she could feel the rhythm of his breath, and for a moment the world narrowed to that shared space. Outside, unseen eyes paused and moved on, paths bending away as if guided by an unspoken rule, and Elena remained unaware of how unusual that was, of how rarely the forest deferred. She felt only the rightness of staying, of choosing patience over caution, and as the first stars appeared, she stood to light a lamp, casting a warm glow that filled the cabin and reflected in the wolf's eyes with a depth that caught her breath. She did not know what he was, only that he was safe for now, and that knowledge was enough to carry her into the night, as something old and watchful stirred beyond the trees, recognizing a debt it could not yet name. The night settled fully around the cabin, bringing with it a hush that felt deliberate, and Elena found herself listening more closely than usual as she lay on her narrow bed, the lamp turned low, the wolf resting on the rug near the hearth where the warmth lingered. Sleep came in pieces, light and easily broken, and each time she stirred she was aware of him, the steady presence that made the small space feel anchored rather than crowded. At some point, she noticed the air itself seemed different, clearer, as if the forest had drawn a careful boundary around the cabin, and when she rose quietly to check on him, she paused, surprised by what she saw. The wolf's breathing was deeper than before, his posture relaxed, and where she had expected stiffness she saw ease, the kind that followed long rest rather than mere survival. She knelt and observed without touching, noting the way his coat seemed to catch the lamplight with a subtle sheen, the way the room held him as if it were built for more than one form. Elena told herself not to read meaning into it, yet she could not ignore the feeling that something was aligning, pieces finding their places without effort. She poured fresh water and set it within reach, and as she did, the wolf opened his eyes, meeting hers with a clarity that made her still. There was no confusion there, no lingering haze, only awareness and a calm that carried weight, and for a moment Elena felt as if she were being seen rather than simply looked at. She breathed out slowly, grounding herself, and spoke his name without knowing why, a soft sound meant only to reassure, and he responded with a gentle movement, shifting closer to the warmth as if in agreement. Hours passed, marked by the slow movement of shadows and the faint sounds of the night beyond the walls. And Elena found herself reflecting on the small changes she had noticed throughout the day. The way the forest seemed to give the cabin more space. The way distant sounds softened as they neared. The way she herself felt steadier than usual. She checked the wolf again near dawn and realized with a start that the signs of strain she had watched for were gone, replaced by strength that felt contained rather than raw, and she wondered how much time had truly passed since the river. When the first pale light filtered through the window, she opened the door to let in fresh air, half expecting the woods to rush back in. But instead there was a respectful quiet. The path outside clear, the morning calm as if waiting. The wolf rose smoothly, testing his footing, and Elena's hand hovered nearby out of habit before she realized he did not need the support. He turned once, surveying the room, then looked back at her with a focus that made her heart skip, and in that look she sensed intention, not urgency, but purpose, the kind that came from remembering something important. Elena stepped aside instinctively, allowing him space, and as he moved toward the door, she felt a strange mix of relief and anticipation, aware that whatever came next would not be as simple as before. He paused at the threshold, glancing back once more, and the connection she felt then was not fear or longing but recognition, as if a quiet promise had been made and accepted. She watched him step into the morning light, unaware of the full measure of what was awakening, only knowing that the kindness she had offered had taken root, and that the world beyond the trees was already shifting in response. The morning held its breath after the wolf stepped into the light, and Elena Moore remained at the doorway longer than she meant to, watching the space where he had been as if the air itself might explain what came next. She closed the door gently and turned back into the cabin, tidying what little there was to tidy, grounding herself in small motions while her thoughts circled the quiet promise she could not name. It was not long before she sensed a change outside, not a sound exactly, but a shift, the way the forest adjusted when something important moved through it, and she felt it in her chest before she heard the careful steps on the path. Elena opened the door to find a man standing there where the wolf had been, tall and composed, his presence fitting the space as naturally as the forest did, his dark hair touched by the light, his expression calm but attentive. She did not step back, though surprise tightened her breath, because recognition arrived alongside it, quiet and certain, as if the truth had been waiting for the right moment to speak. The man inclined his head slightly, a gesture of respect that felt deliberate, and when he met her eyes she saw the same clarity she had seen by lamplight, now carried in a human gaze that held depth and restraint. He spoke her name first, softly, as if testing it in the air, and the sound grounded her, anchoring the impossible to something real. Elena asked the question she needed to ask, not accusing, not afraid, simply curious, and he answered without embellishment, telling her who he was and what had happened in the river in a voice that carried no drama, only truth. She listened, absorbing the weight of his words as they settled into place, the way the forest had made room, the way the cabin had felt prepared, the way the wolf had watched her with recognition, and the pieces aligned with a quiet click. He did not claim anything in that moment, did not demand thanks or loyalty, and that absence mattered more than any declaration could have. He explained that he was King Alaric Blackwood, that the river had taken more from him than strength and returned more than he could have expected, and that her choice to stay had carried him back to himself. Elena considered this with the steadiness she had learned, noting the care in his words, the way he left space for her response, and she realized she was not afraid because nothing in his presence pressed against her will. She told him what she had done and why, not to justify herself, but to place her actions where they belonged, simple and human, and he listened with the same attention he had given her stories by the hearth. The forest seemed to listen too, quiet and receptive, and when he thanked her it was not as a king to a subject, but as one person to another, a debt acknowledged without ceremony. Elena felt the weight of what this revelation might bring, the eyes that would turn her way, the questions that would follow, yet in that moment none of it felt immediate. What mattered was the calm understanding between them, the recognition that strength could be gentle and that mercy could change the shape of a life without seeking permission. Alaric stepped back then, giving her room to breathe, to choose, and that space spoke louder than any promise. Elena met his gaze and nodded once, accepting the truth as it was offered, unaware of how far its echo would carry, only knowing that the river had not taken a king that night because an Omega had stayed, and that the world beyond the trees would soon learn what the forest already knew. The path widened as they walked together, not side by side in a way that invited scrutiny, but with an easy awareness that kept pace without pressure, and Elena more felt the forest release them gradually, sounds returning, light shifting, the ordinary world resuming as if nothing extraordinary had occurred. Alaric Blackwood guided their route with a familiarity that did not intrude, explaining where they were headed and why, speaking of the council that had gathered since dawn, of questions asked in concern rather than suspicion, and of the need for clarity before rumor could take shape. Elena listened, measuring each step, aware of how her life had always been defined by the margins and how suddenly the center was asking her name. When the clearing opened before them, she saw faces turn, some curious, some guarded, some openly surprised, and she recognized a few who had once looked past her without seeing. The air carried a quiet expectation, not the sharp edge of command but the stillness that followed relief, and Alaric stepped forward with a calm authority that required no display. He addressed the gathered wolves plainly, acknowledging the river, the night, and the chance that had nearly rewritten their future, and when he spoke of the one who had stayed, who had chosen patience over fear, his gaze returned to Elena without hesitation. A murmur rippled through the clearing, not outrage but realization, and Elena felt the weight of attention settle without crushing her, supported by the steadiness she had learned in smaller rooms. She spoke when invited, her voice even, recounting what she had done without ornament, emphasizing not courage but necessity, not destiny but choice, and as she did the listening deepened, the kind that follows truth spoken simply. Alaric confirmed her account and named his debt openly, not as a promise to be repaid later, but as an acknowledgment made now, before all, and he stated with equal clarity that protection was not a favor, but a responsibility owed. The words carried through the clearing, setting a tone that left little room for misinterpretation, and Elena noticed how shoulders eased, how uncertainty softened into respect. There was no spectacle, no demand for allegiance, only a public recognition that kindness had weight and that it would be honored. When questions followed, they were measured and brief, and Alaric answered them without diminishing Elena's role or inflating his own, reinforcing the balance she had felt since the cabin, the space that allowed choice to remain choice. As the gathering drew to a close, he turned to her and offered a simple assurance that her days would not be narrowed by whispers or claims, that her home would remain hers, and that she would be heard when she chose to speak. Elena accepted with a nod, not because she needed permission, but because acknowledgement mattered when given with care. The clearing slowly returned to motion, conversations resuming, paths chosen, and as Elena stepped away, she felt the shift settle into place, the understanding that justice could be quiet and that recognition did not require elevation to be real. She glanced back once to find Alaric watching, not possessive, not distant, simply present, and she carried that steadiness with her as she walked back toward the trees, aware that the world had changed without noise, and that her place within it had widened, not by decree, but by truth spoken aloud. The days that followed unfolded with a measured steadiness, the kind that allowed truth to settle rather than flare, and Elena Moore returned to her cabin with the quiet understanding that nothing had been taken from her, only widened. Word traveled without being pushed, carried by those who had been present and those who trusted them, and when others passed her path now their glances held recognition instead of dismissal, curiosity tempered by respect. Elena noticed the change not in grand gestures but in small mercies, space given on narrow trails, greetings offered without expectation, the absence of the familiar pressure to shrink. Alaric Blackwood did not summon her nor linger near her door, and that restraint mattered, allowing her days to remain her own while the world adjusted around a truth it could not ignore. When a council messenger arrived, it was with a simple request rather than an order, asking if she would speak once more, this time not to explain the past but to help shape what came next. Elena considered it carefully, weighing the cost of attention against the value of clarity, and she agreed on her own terms, choosing daylight and an open place where nothing felt hidden. The gathering was smaller this time, purposeful rather than reactive, and Alaric stood among them rather than above, listening first, setting a tone that invited honesty without fear. Elena spoke about the river as a place, about storms and timing and the way choices made in quiet moments carried farther than expected, and as she did she saw understanding take root, not awe, but agreement. Alaric responded by formalizing protections that had always been implied but rarely stated, ensuring that no one would be punished for compassion, that aid given in good faith would be honored, and that the smallest voices would have room to be heard without consequence. The words were practical, not poetic, and that practicality gave them weight, anchoring ideals in policy rather than promise. Elena felt the justice of it not as triumph, but as balance restored, the scales set level without spectacle, and she recognized the strength it took to make such commitments publicly and keep them afterward. When the meeting ended, Alaric approached her with gratitude expressed plainly, acknowledging that leadership was measured not by command but by response, and that her presence had reminded him of what the crown was meant to guard. Elena accepted the thanks without ceremony and offered her own observation. That protection worked best when it was quiet enough to be felt rather than feared, and he nodded, taking the counsel without offense. As the crowd dispersed, Elena returned once more to the forest path, carrying the sense that justice could be durable when built carefully, that recognition could protect without binding, and that her life, unchanged in its essentials, now stood within a wider circle of regard. The cabin welcomed her with familiar warmth, the hearth ready, the air calm, and as evening fell she watched the tree lean where the wolf had once stepped into light, understanding now that saving a life had not elevated her above others, but had drawn the world closer to what it could be. She rested in that knowledge, aware that destiny did not always arrive with thunder, that sometimes it spoke softly, and that when it did, the truest response was to listen and keep living with the same steady kindness that had always been enough. The season turned without announcement, leaves shifting color and light changing its angle, and Elena Moore found that her days settled into a rhythm that felt both familiar and quietly expanded. She walked the same paths, tended the same small tasks, and returned each evening to the cabin that had become a landmark not because of what it held, but because of what had begun there. The forest remained attentive without being intrusive, a presence that acknowledged her without pressing close, and she learned to recognize the balance of it, the way respect felt when it moved both ways. Alaric Blackwood visited rarely and without ceremony, choosing moments that did not interrupt, bringing news only when it mattered, listening more than he spoke, and leaving space for Elena to remain herself. When they did speak, it was of practical things and shared observations, of weather and paths, and the ways leadership could learn from listening, and the ease of those conversations told its own story. Elena noticed how others took cues from that ease, how they addressed her directly now, how assumptions softened into questions, how the edges she had lived on widened into places she could stand without apology. One evening, as the moon rose full and clear, Elena paused by the river, watching the water slide over stone with the same patient voice it had always had, and she felt the echo of that first night without sorrow or longing, only gratitude for the choice she had made to stay. The river did not remember kings or titles, she thought, only weight and balance, and perhaps that was why it had yielded when it did. Alaric joined her at a distance that respected her quiet, and together they watched the current, sharing the silence as an understanding rather than a pause. He spoke then of the road ahead, not as a plan imposed, but as an invitation to consider, to remain exactly where she was, or to step into wider circles when she chose. And Elena appreciated the honesty of it, the absence of urgency. She told him she would keep living as she always had, attentive and present, and that if the world needed her voice again, she would speak as she had before, plainly and without ornament. He accepted that with a nod, recognizing the strength in consistency, and the moonlight seemed to seal the agreement without witness. As the night deepened, Elena returned home alone, lighting the lamp, setting water by the hearth, and feeling the steady satisfaction of a life aligned with itself. She rested knowing that destiny did not demand surrender, that it revealed itself through choices honored over time, and that the gentlest acts could alter the course of many lives without losing their softness. Outside, the forest breathed, the river flowed, and the world continued with a subtle adjustment, as if it had learned something it would not forget. Elena lay down and slept easily, carrying no crown and no claim. Only the quiet certainty that she belonged to herself and to the moments she chose to answer. And somewhere beyond the trees, a king kept watch with renewed clarity, aware that the truest bond had already been formed, not by command or ceremony, but by mercy freely given and freely respected.